Hi, Misha here, and for reasons it seemed like a good idea to pick back up with the Russian main battle tanks. Kind of left off with the T-44, and we will pick up with the T-54, T-55, and so on. But I kind of wanted to fast forward to the current third generation MBT in Russian service. The most modern tank right now, although its successor is supposed to go into production this year, the T-90. So, talk about this. It's actually quite a commercial success. It's considered one of the best modern main battle tanks. Not necessarily so much for cutting-edge abilities, is just reliability, simplicity, and cost. And it's actually one of the most commercially successful on the export market main battle tanks in current history too. And it's actually built on the T-72, taking elements from the T-80. And of course this all extends back to the original T-64, and it extends back into the Soviet era. By the mid-1980s, there were three principal MBTs, although kind of verging on heavy tanks depending on what, because in Soviet service, and two different design paths, but they borrowed from each other to the point that they became rather blended and what have you. The oldest one still in active service would have been the T-64. And the most advanced was the T-80, which is actually quite famous for being the first Soviet turbine-powered tank, and really almost the first turbine-powered tank in the world, excluding Sweden. And the T-72 was kind of originally built to be a less costly and easier to maintain tank for more of the general infantry, leaving the T-80 for more elites. But in any evidence, the T-72B and so on would get many of the same updates and improvements of the T-80, and there were proponents and detractors of both. And the T-64 was actually produced in relatively small numbers by Soviet standards, but was the high technology tank at the time. Of course, there was also the T-62 before it, and even the T-54 and T-55 were not hopelessly obsolescent. But it was decided that one tank should replace, Russia just needed one main battle tank. And quickly there were two design proposals, Object 187M and Object 188. Now, 187M was a pretty radical step forward. Now, both were loosely based on the T-72 because it was considered the most cost-effective to start with. But the 187 was a pretty big step forward. New engine, new turret. The 188 was more of just an upgrade. Some work done to the turret, some done to the fire control systems, some tweaking of the diesel engine. And in 1986, permission was given to kind of go ahead. In 1988, production on a couple of prototypes began. And in 1989, the first four prototypes were delivered of the 188. At this time, these were known as T-72BM, but they would basically be the way forward. They would evolve into the T-72B. Well, there was the BU and the BM upgraded versions. And in 1991, the Ministry of Defense recommended going with this over the Object 187. So that program was suspended, however, not forgotten. Now, the T-72 was used by Iraq. In fact, the little 172 Forces of Valor model here is from an Iraqi tank in the Gulf War. It didn't do great. Kind of gave it a less great reputation. So it was kind of decided to rename it the T-88 to differentiate it, even though there wasn't a lot of difference. Again, it was still a T-72. Well, this would be further turned into the T-90 in 1992 as a propaganda boon, because this is post-Soviet era. They wanted to designate this as the first new tank design of the new decade, the 1990s, so T-90. It was ordered by the Russian Army, and the first production model was delivered in September of that year, and it was initially accepted for service in 1993 and in low-rate production. Only about 200 original T-90s would be delivered, and most of them were built between 93 and 95. The low-rate production would continue throughout the 90s. And actually in 1996, the Russian government officially announced that it would be going with the T-90. There was some debate at the time, either it or the T-80U, a more modern version of the T-80. But it kind of got a bit of a negative reputation in the first Chechen War. Plus, there were some problems with its production. In fact, at this time, Russia only had 2 tank production facilities still running. 2 had shut down, 1 went with Ukraine. So, yeah, things were kind of tight. But they would have it in service, and it was a modern tank. Again, it mostly had an updated fire control system, which was actually kind of borrowed and upgraded from the T-80 using the smoothbore 125mm gun. It could launch regular rounds, also anti-tank missiles, and it had the same type of remote-controlled 12.7mm machine gun as the T-80 series had. It did have a multi-fuel engine, but it ran diesel, whereas the T-80 was gasoline. This was done because the T-80 was awfully thirsty. Another reason they ended up going with the T-90 being diesel-powered. It was a little more fuel-efficient. But of course it had a less than awesome top speed. But they're really all very similar because they're all kind of based and the technology was swapped and they were all updated together and what have you. But very small orders. Now, there would be success exporting the tank to India. And it should be said that the initial T-90s had a cast turret. But the casting facility was out of business. And in 2005, the Russian government ordered 14 more tanks. A large enough order, the factory didn't want to ignore it, but they used up the last of their cast tanks delivering to India, cast turrets delivering to India, and they had no way to make new ones. Now, if the Russian order had been larger, they could have worked a new facility out, but 14 tanks was enough that they wanted the order, but not enough to open up a new facility. And thus we get the first major upgrade, the T-90A. What we got in 2005 was originally known as Object 188A1 and was accepted into the Russian Army as the T-90A. Sometimes nicknamed the Vladimir, allegedly because of its inventor, Vladimir Potkin. But I think we all know which Vladimir it was probably really named after. Certainly didn't hurt. And this really did let them retire most of their other older tanks. Although still, today, a number of T-80 tanks, namely the newer variants, are in active service, and even a handful of T-72s, although most of the T-64s, which are still in inventory, are in the reserve. So the T-90, T-90A, again, had an uprated engine from before. It's about 9.5 meters long, had a top speed of about 60 kilometers, about 37, 38 miles on road, crew of 3, Like most Russian tanks, it had an automatic loading system for the gun. So we had a driver, a commander, and a gunner. This used what they call the carousel system, which had 22 rounds ready to go. And it had another 20 or so rounds stowed in the tank. Again, it could fire standard cannon rounds, which were good anywhere from 2 to 3 kilometers, depending on condition and day and night. It was always day and night capable. It was also always NBC protected, something that Russian armor had really emphasized since the late 50s. It also had a 3-tier armor protection system with reactive armor, and its main gun was able to penetrate up to 37 inches of steel. It could also fire the 9M 119M reflex missile, anti-tank missile, which was good 5 to 6 kilometers out. And it could also be used against low-flying aircraft like helicopters. Same goes with the 12.7 millimeter heavy gun. It was good for aircraft and against ground targets. And then there was a coaxially mounted machine gun in 7.62, just in case. With the T-90A, we got a new turret that was welded versus being cast. They did go to an uprated engine, and they went to the newest Contact 5 reactive, bricks block armor, which did improve things. This also had infrared jammers. It had smoke generators. Not exactly the most modern suite of defenses, but not exactly antiquated either. So they did update the electronics some. And the Russian army actually didn't put the new version through trials, since the changes were pretty limited and quite similar to what had been sent to India. And they must have liked what they received, because they quickly ordered 18 more. And then in both 2006 and 2007, they ordered another 31 each year. And then between 2008 and 2011, they received about 62 tanks annually. They had about 400 T-90As delivered by 2012, in addition to the 200, roughly speaking, T-90s. Now in 2012, they announced that they would not be placing further future orders because they were planning to go to a replacement. Again, this was a evolutionary step forward on the T-72, not a revolutionary step forward. So while it was capable enough, in fact, one of the earliest kind of tests of a T-90 in Russian service was back in 1999, when one was sent to the Chechen area, and it was reported that one of them took 7 hits from RPGs, and the armor held up and actually kept on ticking. But, they wanted something a little more up to date. So what they were working on was the Object 148, which was based on a canceled tank known as the T-95. But what's interesting, the T-95 itself was based on that old Object 187. And this design is still scheduled to go into service as the T-14, with the derivative as the T-15. And the 2022 is supposed to be when it's going into full rate production. I guess we'll see. So they quit taking deliveries of new T-90s, but they did continue to improve the design and update the equipment. For example, in 2016, a new domestically designed and produced thermal imaging sight was announced for the tank, which was good because it would cut Russia's dependence on foreign components for infrared and night vision and all that good stuff. You did have, of course, computers and everything. As with most Soviet-type designs, it wasn't the most advanced, but it was durable. And, the tank was again, plenty good enough. Also, with the A model, they would go to an updated version of the cannon known as the M2. Same smoothbore, 125 millimeter. They also sometimes would change the machine gun There are a couple of different models of heavy machine gun, remotely operated, applied. And they would improve the protection. Like a lot of Soviet-era tanks, the ammo wasn't stored in like a vault, fireproof vault. So if the armor were to be penetrated, it could explode like a Ronson. So there were some efforts later on to kind of protect against that, as well as expand the sighting and whatnot abilities for the crew. But yeah, this model, there aren't many companies that make the T-90. This one I actually imported out of Russia. It's the Fabry, the Eagle Moss, so it's not the most detailed, but inexpensive, and it is mostly metal with rubber tracks and a moving turret, so hey, it does as a good example piece. But even though orders were said to be over by 2012, that's actually not the end of the story. We have one final version, the T-90M. In 2017, the T-90M was first announced, and initially the Russian army would order 20. Now the T-90M can either be a new built tank or can be an updated T-90A. It had a redesigned turret, much more advanced fire control system, including a data link. It even had sat-nav, so you couldn't get lost. It had a further improved gun known as the M5 version. It was said to be 15, maybe even 20% more accurate, which is good because even though some Russian sources claimed 80% accuracy, this seems to have been more propaganda. The gun wasn't known for superlative accuracy, even though it was fully stabilized and all that good stuff. And it also would have what was called relict armor bricks instead of the older Contact 5, so an improvement there. A further uprated engine, and yeah, some other little changes like that. And again, new day-night vision optics for the crew. Like I said earlier, they were improving the safety of the ammunition storage, things like that. You know, a nice solid improvement package to the design. And the first ones were delivered to the Russian army in 2019, with further batches in 2020 and 2021. At this time, pretty much all the original ones were out of service or in reserve, and it's estimated that about 750, maybe as many as 1,000, are in active Russian army service. Also, the Russian Marines use a much smaller number of these tanks. And as I said, the first time these were really deployed in combat was in Chechnya in 1999. But that was kind of the early version. The A would go into service and would first be used in, well, let's be honest, Ukraine, the Donbass region, in 2014. Pictures of the T-90A were taken there. And then in 2015, these were deployed to Syria. And actually in Syria, they did really well. There's no confirmed destruction of a T-90 tank, despite several attempts by the opposition in that country. Now, at least one was destroyed during a training accident, but that was Russian on Russian. But the armor and the systems seem to be holding up quite well, all things considered. And some of the tanks were updated and redelivered and whatnot as of last year. So even though there's still plans to replace it beginning this year, this is the most cutting-edge tank in full military service and with full adoption, and as it should be. Like I said, it's considered a third-generation MBT, and even then, they went through the 90, the 90A, and the 90M versions. And of course, there are other versions too for export and variants and whatnot. And while it is a modern tank, you can still see the T-72 and even T-80 roots in it. But this is their current tank. And in some ways, it's a newer design than the M1 Abrams. If you think about it, the Abrams is quite the old tank. The British Challenger 2 is getting on 20 years now, so it's kind of hanging in there. It's not the best, but yeah. Well, I hope you've enjoyed kind of returning to the Russian armor series. I have a whole lot of different ones to talk about, going back for pre-World War II to modern day, and not just tanks and everything, but I've got a lot of artillery pieces, even missiles to talk about. It is a particular interest to me. Again, some of these are things that I've even climbed around on in real life, and this is quite interesting. And there's definitely a lineage here. The Russians have kind of, even though they're different design bureaus and whatnot, they have no problem copying good ideas from each other. In fact, that was encouraged during the Soviet times. It'll be interesting to see if the T-14 and T-15 really do materialize and how successful they are. But for now, the T-90 and even some older T-80s are holding the line. And there's still some A models, but the front lines are probably going to be your AMs, which are upgraded A's, or just your M's. And like I said, this was a big export success too. Most notably, India. They've actually ordered nearly 1,700, including some that they're building in-country from Russian kits and domestic production. So India seems quite taken with it. And Algeria, Iraq, Vietnam. I think I've also seen something about Venezuela purchasing some. Yeah, it's actually been a good export project for Russia that's brought in cold hard cash, something they definitely could use. Well, with that, guys, I'll let you go. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon.